So thank you all for attending this webinar as an introduction to the Indigenous-led participatory and cumulative impact assessment. We have a recorded presentation from Mr. Anders Blom, and the presentation provides some good introductory and background information on Anders and discusses the IPCIA method in detail. After the recording of the presentation, we'll have time for a Q&A session, in which time we welcome any questions, points for clarification, or comment discussion. So with no further ado, Thad, could you please start the video?
So good morning to you all. This is an introduction to IPCIA, which is short for Indigenous-led Participatory and Cumulative Impact Assessment. I will start with an introduction, and that is that land is the foundation of the lives and culture of Indigenous people all over the world. Without access to and respect for their rights over their lands, territories, and natural resources, the survival of Indigenous people's particular distinct culture is threatened. And that is a statement from the United Nations Permanent Forum on the Indigenous issue from 2007, the same year as the United Nations Declarations of the Right of Indigenous People were signed in 144 countries worldwide. But when we are talking about land, we are not talking about any land. I mean, most people, when they look at this picture, they think this is a great wilderness. But actually, this is a cultural landscape, an Indigenous cultural landscape. And those landscapes are living landscapes to which Indigenous people attribute environmental, social, cultural, and economic values because of their enduring relationship to the land, water, flora, fauna, and spirit, as well as their present and future importance to their culture, identity. And ICL is characterized by features maintained through long-term interaction based on land care knowledge and adaptive livelihood practices. They are landscapes over which Indigenous people exercise responsibility for stewardship. In that landscape, approximately 500 million Indigenous people live, and it represents about 25% of Mother Earth's surface. In that landscape, 80% of the remaining biodiversity in the world is. And the new green industrial transformation has created a new green colonialism. Many Indigenous people and their ICLs are now doubly affected. First affected by climate change, but now also affected by the adaptation measures implemented to combat climate change, whether new mines, new fossil-free forms of energy, or increased forestry operations. So the world must become better at respecting Indigenous people's right to self-determination and actively listening to Indigenous people's knowledge that can be decisive in the war against the climate disaster. And in this work, FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, is of fundamental importance. So what is then FPIC? Well, FPIC can be seen both as a right, as a principle, and as a process. As a right, all people have the right to self-determination, whether the right to grant, withhold, and withdraw consent is a collective right specific to Indigenous peoples. The normative framework for the rights to FPIC is based on international law. FPIC as a principle, for instance, within the ASI, as such, FPIC is not dependent on an endorsement by national laws and legislations to be a valid standard for human existence. As a result, actions respecting FPIC may directly conflict with national laws or fall within a policy gap. FPIC as a process. FPIC can also be viewed as a process, in this case illustrated from the ASI FPIC guidance document that offers better practice engagement tools throughout the resource development cycle. This view of FPIC falls in line with the human rights-based principle of participatory decision-making. In its new performance standard, ASI in version 3.1 has decided that FPIC should be mandatory in certified operations. This is not dependent on national regulations or national recognition of Indigenous people, nor does the granting of a license remove the entity's obligations to conduct FPIC under the ASI performance standard. So how can we then interpret the word FPIC? Well, free means that we are seeking a consent, free given, voluntarily and without coercion, intimidation, or manipulation. A process that is self-directed by the community from whom consent is being sought, unencumbered by coercion, expectations, or timelines that are externally imposed. With prior, we mean that the consent is sought sufficiently in advance of any authorization or commencement of activities. Informed refers to the engagement and type of information that should be provided prior to seeking consent and also as a part of the ongoing consent process. And finally, the consent, that's a collective decision made by the right holders and reached through a customary decision-making process of the communities. So now I'm going to welcome you to Sápmi, the land of the Sámi people, which is the area where I'm coming from. Sápmi is situated in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia. It encompasses 4 countries, parts of Norway, parts of Sweden, parts of Finland, and parts of Russia. In Sápmi, the Sámi people, many of them are reindeer herders, and they are reindeer herders since time immemorial. And we can see proof of that in rock carvings that goes more than 7,000 years back in time. The reindeer herding, the reindeer husbandry are suffering from a lot of threats and have a lot of challenges in our indigenous cultural landscape. We see problems with the climate that creates a need for feeding of our animals. We have a lot of windmill farms coming up. We have new mines. We have new infrastructure, power lines, tourism, building of houses, predators, and aggressive forestry, to mention some of our challenges. To make a formal concession when we are meeting all those challenges, the I in the FPIC, we the Sámi people needed to develop our own methods and tools based on our traditional knowledge in combination with modern science and modern mapping technology. This laid the foundation for developing our IPCIA methodology. So what is then an IPCIA and why should an ASI certified entity care about this? Well, the IPCIA method is the result of more than 12 years of experience in participatory impact assessment for and with Indigenous people in Sápmi. The Indigenous consultants within Protect Sápmi, that's my mother organization, has been engaged in numerous numbers of IPCIA, close to 20. ASI's interest in the method was sparked after an ASI certified entity was affected by an IPCIA investigation in Norway. And the method has been described in a guidance document in a collaboration with the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, and the manual of the guidance document can be loaded down from the ASI website. In the recently prepared ASI guidance document for the implementation of FPIC for ASI certifying entities, recommendations have been made to work in accordance with the IPCIA methodology. And in that methodology, as you see in the picture, we are working in a 6th step. And in the 3rd step, it is written that conduct an IPCIA if impact assessments are undertaken, work collaboratively with the Indigenous people. There are today a lot of different types of impact assessments, and it's a little bit like comparing apples and pears. You can find environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment, business impact assessment, economic impact assessment, human rights impact assessment. But the purpose of all these impact assessments is primarily to inform authorities or companies about the consequences of a certain project or a certain activity. Often this is governed by national regulations. An IPCIA is carried out to primarily create a basis for affected Indigenous people to be able to make their own informed decisions in an FPIC process, basis for giving, withdrawing, or giving a modified consent to proposed activities. This is rarely governed by national regulations, but has its origin in international law and in various voluntary certification models, such as the ASI. But then what makes IPCIA unique? Well, first, the work with an IPCIA is led by trained Indigenous people with the right cultural and linguistic knowledge together with the affected Indigenous people. The work is always based on a cumulative perspective because most Indigenous people are not only affected by a single encroachment problem. The method is largely based on the traditional knowledge of the affected Indigenous people about their land, their culture, their ecosystem services, their Indigenous cultural landscape. Modern science also has a role in the work, but in combination with traditional knowledge. The method measures how the traditionally practiced ecosystem services are affected, taking into account both people, landscapes, and the culture that is prevalent among the concerned Indigenous people. Together with the affected Indigenous people, all impacts to which the affected Indigenous people are exposed are mapped in a participatory mapping. So let's give you an example then of what do I mean by cumulative impact. This is a map from a Swedish Sámi community where they are practicing reindeer husbandry. A mine was coming up and it had to be investigated, but simultaneously we saw one windmill park, another windmill park, and a third windmill park. And together with aggressive forestry and hunting tourism, we saw a barrier through the landscape. So what we could say is that the cumulative impact can be described as how an activity or measure together with other ongoing past or future activities measures affect the Indigenous people and the traditionally practiced ecosystem service, as in this example. I mentioned that traditional knowledge is important in an IPCIA, and traditional knowledge is at the core of Indigenous people's identities, culture, heritage, and livelihood. The transmission of traditional knowledge across generations is fundamental to protecting and promoting Indigenous people's cultures and identities and management of lands, territories, and resources, with Indigenous practices that care for Earth without depleting the resources. So you could say that traditional knowledge underlines Indigenous people's holistic approach of life. Traditional knowledge is not the only base in our IPCIA. I also mentioned earlier that we also work together with scientific knowledge, and we try to integrate those two knowledge blocks into each other. With the respect that the traditional knowledge comes from a holistic view, it's linked to cosmovision, there is a trust for inherited wisdom, respect for Mother Earth, there is a local verification, qualitative oral records, integrated and applied to daily living, knowledge on plants, animals, and ecosystems, empirical verification over a very long time through repetition. While the contemporary scientific research is based on and limited to evidence and explanation with physical word, skepticism, controlled experimentations, quantitative written reports, discipline-based reductionistic theories, and mathematical models. And we try in our work to see if these two words can be merged in an integrated knowledge. Traditional practice ecosystem is a key in the IPCIA, and traditional practice ecosystem services are the ongoing accumulation of knowledge, practice, and belief about relationship between living beings in a specific ecosystem that is acquired by Indigenous people over hundreds or sometimes thousands of years through direct contact with the environment, handed down through generations and used for life-sustaining ways. This knowledge includes the relationship between people, plants, animals, natural phenomena, landscapes, and timing of events for activities such as hunting, fishing, trapping, herding of animals, agriculture, and forestry. It encompasses the worldview of a people, which includes ecology, spirituality, human and animal relationship, and more. In an IPCIA, we investigate how a planned project and encroachment can affect the traditionally practiced ecosystem services. And some of the examples of these services are illustrated in this picture. Participatory mapping is also an important part of the IPCIA. Participatory mapping can be done with sophisticated GIS method, but hand-drawn maps are also important. But it's important that the result of the mapping work must always belong to the concerned Indigenous people. This content is their intellectual property. Historically, mapping has predominantly been an instrument of colonization and administrative control. However, this has changed as mapping has increasingly become an instrument for Indigenous people to challenge the dominant narrative of land use and tenure. Mapping is used today by Indigenous people as a method to document land use, to negotiate land and resource rights. The goal of the mapping in an IPCIA is to record the negative impacts of traditional ecosystem services as well as important cultural and religious sites. In the final of an IPCIA, we are making a risk and vulnerability analysis, a RAW, and it includes studying the different effect of a negative impact on 3 geographical levels: the local influence in direct connection to the area of influence, and down and upstream influence at the intermediate and regional level. The analysis divide the impact on ecosystem services, landscape, and people. And the analysis also make a probability assessment of the effect of an impact in the form of direct impact and indirect impact. And we use this template where we color the squares with different colors, but depending on how necessary it is to proceed with mitigation actions or actions to avoid harm. And that color template will then be the basis for a mitigation plan. So this was theory. Now we're going into some practical example, and we're going to start in Sápmi in Norway. So we are going to start with the Øyfjellet case. In 2019, the Sámi reindeer district, Gyllenjarke, contacted Protect Sápmi regarding the plans to build a wind power park within the district that would seriously affect reindeer husbandry. And the plans were supposed to be built in the mountain you see on this picture. Gyllenjarke wanted help from Protect Sápmi to carry out an impact analysis, an IPCIA that would describe the planned wind power park's impact on reindeer husbandry. Neither the companies concerned nor the authorities in Norway had carried out a real FPIC process where the affected Indigenous people have been heard for their criticism and for the great impact the current project will have on their ability to exercise their traditional activities. We accepted the work from Protect Sápmi's side, and the first step was to gather information together with the right holder to have their explanation what the case is about and what they want help with. In this case, it's about a company, Euros Wind, wanting to build 72 turbines in an area that is actively used by the reindeer herding district. The planned wind farm with its turbines will be one of the largest in Norway. The affected area for the installation is a connecting area between different seasonal pastures, and its important migration routes run through the area. In our IPCIA terminology, we call the planned wind farm a primary object. The local aluminium producer Alcoa is buying all the power generated from the park in a 15-year deal, making its factory in the town of Mosjøen run on locally produced renewable energy. The next step in the process, in the IPCI process, is to make the process agreement. And the process agreement is drawn up and signed by the parties, the reindeer herding district and the wind power company. The process agreement can cover an entire FPIC process, but in some cases, the agreement only refers to the work with the planned IPCIA, which was the case here. The process agreement may include timelines, frequency and location of meetings, financial commitments, use of advisors, dispute resolutions, secrecy issues, intellectual property, and more. And it is important to state that this agreement does not imply a position on the main issue, but is only a regulation on how the continued cooperation is to be carried out, the rules of the game. We start to map the primary object, and in this GIS map, you see we have drawn in the 70 plus wind turbines with a disturbance zone, the dashed area for the wind power park on 5 kilometers. We have also made drawings of roads with influence zones of 1 kilometer in one case and 1.5 in another case. And those disturbance zones are based on scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge. The next step is to describe all secondary objects. And those objects that could be significant for the affected reindeer herding district. And that could be roads, power lines, buildings, railroads, mines, hydropower, future plans of industrial activities, infrastructure, and more. And for each secondary object, an assessment is made of the impact this object has, that is, which area of influence is relevant. These zones of influence are established by considering both modern research and traditional knowledge. And this is an important step to be able to perform the cumulative analysis. The cumulative analysis first started with the mapping, where we use a GIS system, and we start here, for instance, to map buildings with its disturbance zones, roads and trails, small power lines, big power lines, hydropower, snowmobile trails, and some more. And when we had done all those secondary objects, we form them all together in one polygon. So this brownish area is the area that is somehow impacted for this reindeer herding community. The next step is to transform this into figures, and we can see that the total area that are affected is 54% of the area within the district. But what is more important is that 72% of the winter grazing land is impacted, and that is a threshold. 51 of the spring grazing, 29 of the summer grazing, and autumn grazing goes to 51. So the results, the IPCIA investigation showed that the reindeer husbandry in Jelenjarki would be very negatively affected by the planned wind farm, despite proposed adaptation measures. Authorities and the wind power company did not take this into account. The wind farm was built and started operations in 2022, which led to public demonstrations in the Sami world. And the case is now under legal review, where the IPCIA investigation forms an important part of the evidence to be assessed in the court. Alcoa will undergo an audit in the coming year, and it remains to be seen whether there will be any deviations in relation to the ASI performance standard, as the wind farm in question can be considered an associated facility. So that was the first example. Next example is actually two examples, and they're coming from India. We had two survey sites in India. The first one was Bagru village, Lohardaga in Jharkhand, where we were going to study the cumulative impact assessment on Bagru Hills bauxite mines by Hidalgo Industry Limited. And the second site was in Amgir Hill of Kalahandi and Rayagada in Odisha, to understand the potential impact of the proposed bauxite mining by Vedanta Aluminium Limited. The IPCIA studies in India were conducted under the leadership of a research team from Indian Social Institute in New Delhi, in collaboration with Indian and Norwegian representatives from ASI's Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, IPAF. Bagru village is situated in Lohardaga district of Jharkhand, as you see on the map. In Bagru village, that includes 5 different hamlets with a total of 908 houses populated with an Oraon, Mali, Aher, and Gadaria indigenous communities. The history of bauxite mining in the Ranchi district dated back to 1933. During the latter part of the 1950s, the Indian company Hidalgo took over the mine. According to the people of Bagru, their land has been occupied by the company since 1958. The objective of the study in Bagru village was to demarcate the indigenous cultural landscapes boundaries and map the places. To understand the provisioning, regulating culture, traditional, and supporting ecosystem services. To measure the impact of mining on the indigenous cultural landscapes and traditional ecosystem services in a cumulative perspective. To evaluate and recommend the IPCIA methodology. And the study was carried out in accordance with the IPC guidance document. Effects of the mining up in the village that we found out after the study was done. We could see that initially the villagers leased the land to the company for 3 years. After the 3 years, when the villagers went to claim their lands back, the company refused to return it. The villagers were forcefully displaced from the land, their houses were destroyed so they could not return, the villagers were rendered landless. Some compensation was paid to some people, but not all, and some were offered low-level jobs. For Indigenous people, the land is life, temple, and God, as they draw meaning and livelihood, and everything that lives in it. By losing their land, people have lost everything and have become landless. Culturally important places and the traditional ecosystem services have been seriously affected or destroyed. Free, prior, and informed consent has not been practiced at all. And the IPCIA methodology is considered successful through the participatory perspective. Knowledge has emerged that was not previously documented in various assessments. The methodology is recommended for continued use in India. The second case in India was the case about Nyamgiri Hill. Nyamgiri Hill is the only place in Odisha where Dongaria Kond, one of the particularly vulnerable tribal groups in Odisha, are living since immemorial time. The Dongaria Kond's relationship with Nyamgiri Hill is like oxygen and human being. They are on the verge of an extreme population decline, but have maintained their unique life and culture on the top of Nyamgiri Hill at Kalahandi and Rayagada district of Odisha. Plans for a bauxite mine on Nyamgiri Hill were proposed over 20 years ago, but the Indian Supreme Court's ruling said for any development villages, consent is required. So the objective with this study was to demarcate the Indigenous Cultural Landscapes boundaries and map the places, to understand the provisioning, regulating culture, traditional and supporting ecosystem services, to measure the potential impact of mining on the Indigenous cultural landscape and traditional ecosystem services in a cumulative perspective, to evaluate and recommend the IPCIA methodology, and it was done according to the IPCIA guiding document. So the IPCIA study led to some conclusions. Mining in Nyamgiri Hill is a self-harm for the state and society that will create irreparable damage to Dongaria Kond society, environment, and biodiversity. It is a threat to the social, traditional, cultural, spiritual, religious life and livelihood on Dongaria Kond. Forcefully evicting of the affected Indigenous people will erase their culture. It will erase their identity permanently in the history of human civilization. It is rare habitat that must be preserved and protected. The IPCIA also noted that the nearby aluminium refinery at Lanjigarg at the foot of the Nyamgiri has had significant impact with both water and air pollution. The refinery has drawn new people to the region, including to establish associated businesses such as service industries, workshops, hotels, shops, and accommodations, often on unauthorized lands. The India IPCIA project results show the benefits of the IPCIA method through active participation of Indigenous people. The IPCIA method used to assess development impacts from an Indigenous people's perspective is powerful. It covered the traditional, social, cultural, religious, economic, political, and environmental impacts of proposed mining on Nyamgiri Hill. And this study is, of course, in addition to various international guidelines, constitutional provisions, laws, and judgments that protects the rights of Indigenous people. So, next and the final example is coming from Australia. And it's about the Angamuthi people and the Seven River Country. The Angamuthi people's traditional land includes an area of northwestern Cape York Peninsula in Queensland, an area that is equal to a small European country. The traditional lands of the Angamuthi people includes culturally and ecologically significant land and sea countries. The Angamuthi people have the land rights to the traditional land. The area is also rich in minerals such as bauxite. In Australian legislation, the government retains ownership of all minerals. The Angamuthi people feel that their traditional land is subject to increased interest, not least from mining. This is behind their Healthy Country Plan, which is an expression of their ambition to be good stewards who, with self-determination and developed FPIC processes, can lead to increased control over the cultural landscape that is the basis of the Angamuthi culture. And in their Seven River Healthy Country Plan, they are focusing on getting back to the country, maintain culture and language, pass on traditional knowledge for managing country to young generations, to establish sustainable livelihoods on country, and to restore the overall health of the country. The objective with the IPCIA is to learn, develop, and implement the IPCIA process, to conduct baseline surveys, to document, record, monitor, and develop management requirements for cultural sites and environmental sensitive areas, develop and implement detailed biodiversity management plans for key species and habitats, identify the key threats that are impacting the natural resources and cultural values and develop management plans for their protection, to work with conservation experts to develop and implement a species recovery plan for culturally important species such as the painted freshwater Jardin river turtle. The time plan for the IPCIA work has already started. Work on developing an IPCIA has already started, but time is short as the Seven River County is subject of great interest from many stakeholders. And in the map on the right side, you see the granted licenses in Cape York regions since the 1st of January 2015 for mining activities. ASI, IPAF, and other collaborative partners are strongly committed to supporting Angamuthi people meet their goals and management of their traditional lands. And by that, I end this presentation and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Anders, for that pre-recorded presentation. It's generated a number of questions that are in the Q&A. So if we work through those, and if anyone's got any additional questions, please feel free to put in the Q&A box. So the first question is, what are ASI's previous and ongoing support for development and proliferation of the use of IPCIA methods among Indigenous communities? So with discussion with Anders Blom, ASI provided some resources for Protect Sápmi and for Anders to lead the update of the IPCI methodology as developed by Sápmi people, and then also interpret that in English. Through further discussions with Indigenous People Advisory Forum members, it was decided to try the method in India in those two examples provided by Anders, and to see if that method can be applied from the Sápmi lands to India. And then it was further discussed, and the preliminary work is underway as described by Anders in Northern Australia. So ASI has provided the funding and support, and importantly for Anders to participate in those projects as a mentor and advisor to help the participants apply the method. So the next question may be best directed at you, Anders. What are the plans for the future spreading of the IPCIA use?
Well, thank you for that question, Mark. Well, as you have heard in my presentation, it is important to have Indigenous people working as consultants in an IPCIA, and that might be a bit problematic to find well-educated Indigenous consultants. So what we are trying now to do is to set up a training program to train Indigenous people to become the advisors in the IPCIA projects coming up. And there is a big interest for this, but so far we are still struggling to find sufficient funds to start those training activities. But in due time, we will probably do that.
Okay, thanks, Anders. The next question is, are there similar approaches being used as supported or developed in other parts of the world that you're aware of, and are there differences to the IPCIA method? Anders, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I can try. To work with cumulative impact assessment has been done before. I think the first examples came from Canada in the environmental sector. But when we started 12 years ago, there was no one else, as far as we know, in the indigenous world that were practicing the same methodology as we were. We have seen, as we have been working, that there are attempts to develop cumulative impact assessment led by indigenous people in other parts of the world. But I think that they haven't yet developed the methodology as far as we have done. We have also seen that a lot of commercial consultant companies have started to talk about the need for doing cumulative assessment in different kinds of projects. And there is also coming some signals from the legal world. For instance, in Norway, we had a Supreme Court ruling lately in a windmill park that had a severe impact on indigenous people in an area of Norway. And in that ruling, it was stated that there is a need in future impact assessment to add the cumulative perspective. So I would say that cumulative impact assessment will be more spread. The way we are working has started to spread, but we still need to develop and educate indigenous consultants who can practice the methodology.
Thanks, Anders. And just to add to that, in general, Indigenous people's participation in various forms of impact assessments are generally restricted to field assistance, and they generally do not include traditional knowledge as equal to Western science-based knowledge. That's slowly starting to improve, but as Anders outlined, that's not the same method as the IPCIA method. The next question talks about, for the pilot cases in India and Australia, and with regard to those, are they sensing any improvement for those affected groups, or is it too early to tell? With regard to the Australia project, that's very new, only the last couple of months, so it's very formative. So that work is still underway and will take several more months. And to be a fully complete IPCIA implementation will probably take another year or so. So it's quite a significant body of work. For the two India projects, it captured the information as briefly outlined by Anders in the presentation, and has been used as a tool for further discussion with various companies and organizations, and including some government entities in India. So it's been a very good point for discussion and for sharing a different approach to understanding impacts on respective areas. Anders, would you like to add any comment?
Yeah, I would like also to make a compliment to what you said. I think it's important to say that the Australian IPCIA is a baseline study where we are trying to see what is the situation at this present time, while the Indians one are done with the reference to primary objects, to mining activities that is planned or is ongoing. But both angles are useful within the IPCIA. We are talking both about baseline studies and about IPCIA with the primary object which is in the middle of the case.
Okay, thanks, Anders. The next question is from one of the French speakers, and it is, how can cumulative impacts be resolved responsibly?
Well, I think if you're doing an impact assessment, if you're not having the cumulative perspective, you are not doing it responsibly. I mean, in an indigenous cultural landscape, you might have a lot of encroachments, and traditionally, the regulations often point out that a new mine should be assessed as a single part of that landscape, but it doesn't work in that way in real life, because as I showed in my presentation, we have a lot of parallel ongoing processes, a lot of parallel impacts, and if you don't bring them all together and show them in a cumulative perspective, you are not doing a responsible investigation of that cultural indigenous landscape.
Okay, thanks, Anders. We've got a couple more questions. One is, how can stakeholders leverage the ASI standard and system to prevent situations like those to happen? I've got a brief answer to that, and then, Anders, the following two would be best presented to you. So with regard to leveraging the ASI standard and system to prevent situations like this happening again, being those various cases, I'm presuming, the IPCIA method enables a more informed discussion, and it enables a holistic assessment of whatever the activity might be, and then to utilize that informed discussion within the standard and the assurance process. So, for example, that could include bringing to the attention of auditors the information developed and established by an IPCIA method. It could be to bring to the attention and the awareness of certified entities, so that they are fully across and aware some of the cumulative impacts and some of the associated facilities or areas of influence. So again, there's an informed discussion, an informed consideration, and auditors are made aware of all of the issues that are at hand that are developed by this comprehensive methodology. Anders, would you like to add to that?
I think you did it well. So,
okay, thanks. So the next two questions are related. How was Alcoa allowed to move forward with their wind turbines park, even though their site is certified by ASI? Now that there's evidence of serious violation of affected Indigenous people's fundamental rights, what are the ASI pathways for this site? And related to that is, do you know why the authorities and the wind company did not take impact assessment of Protect Sápmi into account?
Well, this is an interesting question, because what we see today is that we have a severe impact of climate. I am, for instance, today sitting in the middle of a snowstorm, which has brought up a lot of activities to combat the climate change. And one of the combats to climate change is to introduce fossil-free energy forms. Windmills parks are an example of that. And which means that suddenly we see what we in the indigenous world today call the green colonialism. The indigenous people are now many times suffering first from the effect of climate change, and then of the adaptation measures to climate change, such as building a hydropower dam or a windmill park. And for the forestry and for the politicians, the combat of climate change have had a priority to human rights in this case. So the Alcoa company, when they were acting in this case, they were doing it in good faith, because they wanted to introduce a fossil-free energy to their plant, but they didn't have the information enough to realize that that would also have an impact, a negative impact on the indigenous people in question. Now, the authorities, they made a priority of the combat of climate, and did not make a priority of the human right in this case. So now it's up to the court and the court system to see which would be the top priority. Would it be human rights, or would it be the climate combat? When it comes to the ASI system, there is an audit coming up for Alcoa in the coming year, 2025, and it will be interesting to see if this will have an impact on their certificate. We do not know that yet, but this plant can very well be regarded as an associated facility, which means that it should be regarded when you are doing the auditing process. But that is a bit premature to have an assessment of yet.
Thanks, Anders. And just to clarify, the wind park is not an Alcoa wind park. It is an independent company that established the wind park under government permission and sells that energy on the market. And in this case, it was purchased by the company, and that's why this discussion was generated. So, as Anders described in detail, some of the background to that also. We've now gone over our time with regard to the webinar, and thanks for people for attending and your questions. The webinar will be available via YouTube, and that connection will be shared with people. And if anyone wants to have further discussion or consideration of this topic, please reach out through the contacts that are made available. You can reach out to me with an email, and then we could perhaps set up a discussion with Anders, myself, and or others, subject to availability, and progress the discussion from there. So thanks, everyone. Thad's just shared my email, so please feel free to reach out and we can share those details. So thank you, Anders. Really appreciate your time in putting the presentation together and having the discussion with the webinar.
Thank you, Mark.